The banquet hall looked like something had died in it, and something had. Marcus Wynne stood at the edge of the wreckage with a silver service tray tucked under one arm and a damp cloth folded over the other, surveying the damage with the quiet patience of a man who had been cleaning up after other people's disasters for 26 years. Crystal goblets lay shattered across the marble floor in a spray pattern that told him exactly how the table had gone over, pulled from the left side, hard, which meant the Keith Ronnie delegation had done the pulling. The centerpiece, a sculptural arrangement of frozen methane flowers that had cost the ambassador's office 4,000 credits and taken 2 days to assemble, had shattered into a slush of gray-blue fragments that were already sublimating in the warm air of the Vayanthi diplomatic cruiser. The worst of it was the wine, Ilashan black vintage, poured from a decanter that was older than Marcus's entire career in service, now pooled across 3 meters of white Vayanthi marble in a stain that looked like a bruise spreading across pale skin. It would take him 2 hours to lift that stain. 3. If the acid in the vintage had already started etching the stone. He set the tray on an undamaged side table and knelt beside the wine stain, pressing 2 fingers into the marble to test the surface. Cool, slightly tacky. The acid had started but hadn't set. 2 hours then, maybe less if he used the alkalite paste instead of the standard neutralizer. Behind him, the banquet hall's high doors stood open, and the sound of raised voices carried from the corridor beyond Vayanthi voices, tight with the particular register that their species used when institutional panic was being compressed into procedural language. Marcus understood enough Vayanthi to catch the important words: treaty collapse, Keith Ronnie withdrawal, the Empress will need to be informed. He filed the words away and started working on the stain. This was the 63rd diplomatic function Marcus had served aboard the Ascending Grace, the Vayanthi Empire's premier diplomatic cruiser, and the 4th that had ended in a delegation walking out. He had joined the ship's household staff 18 months ago on a service contract brokered through the Terran Labor Exchange, one of 19 humans scattered across a crew complement of 1,200 Vayanthi. Most of the humans worked in engineering or cargo handling. Marcus was the only one in the formal household. He was 47 years old, lean, quiet, with close-cropped gray-black hair and hands that were always clean no matter what he'd been doing an hour before. He wore the household uniform, a fitted dark jacket over a white high-collared shirt, dark trousers, soft-soled shoes that made no sound on marble, and he wore it the way he wore everything, as though it had been made for him and he had forgotten it was there. The Vayanthi had hired him because humans had a reputation for being unobtrusive, for a species that conducted its most important political negotiations over elaborate multi-course meals served in rooms designed to intimidate. An invisible servant was worth his weight in refined crystal. Marcus was very good at being invisible. He worked the alkalite paste into the wine stain in slow circular motions, pressing the neutralizer into the stone's grain, watching the purple-black blotch begin to lighten at the edges. Around him, the banquet hall held the particular silence of a room that had recently been full of anger. Overturned chairs, a diplomatic document folder, its spine cracked, lying open near the head of the table with its crystalline datasheets scattered like fallen leaves. A single Keith Ronnie glove, abandoned on the floor near the door, the left hand, which meant the Keith Ronnie trade envoy had pulled it off in the gesture their species used to signal that honor had been violated beyond repair. Marcus picked up the glove and set it aside on the service tray. Someone from the diplomatic corps would want it. The glove was evidence. In Keith Ronnie culture, an abandoned left glove meant the conversation was over, permanently. But that was not all it meant, and Marcus knew the difference because he had spent 6 months refilling the water glass of the man who had dropped it. He heard footsteps behind him, soft shoes on marble of Vayanthi, moving quickly but trying not to look like they were rushing. Marcus did not turn around. He kept working. Wind. The voice belonged to Overseer Thesson, the head of household staff. Thesson was a mid-rank Vayanthi administrator, efficient, harried, and perpetually surprised that the human servant never needed to be told anything twice. He stood in the doorway now, his pale ice-blue skin slightly flushed at the neck, a sign of stress he probably didn't know was visible. "Sir," Marcus said, still kneeling. "Leave the hall. The Empress's household has called an emergency session. All non-essential staff are to return to quarters until further notice. The wine stain will set if I leave it. 2 hours of surface damage becomes permanent. The stain is not a priority when." Marcus considered this. Then he reached into the small kit on his belt, withdrew a second measure of alkalite paste, and spread a thick layer over the remaining stain. It would hold for 6 hours. Not ideal, but it would keep the acid from eating through. "Done," he said. He stood, collected his tray with the glove on it, and walked toward the door. "Leave the glove," Thesson said. "Diplomatic materials stay in the hall." "It's not diplomatic material, sir. It's a personal item. I'll log it and store it in the pantry for retrieval." Thesson was already moving away down the corridor, speaking into a comm unit in rapid Vayanthi. He did not argue. Nobody argued with the human servant about object handling. It was beneath the threshold of things worth noticing. Marcus walked in the other direction, toward the service corridors that ran behind the formal spaces of the ascending grace like the blood vessels behind a face. These were his corridors, narrow, functional, lit by flat white panel light instead of the warm gold chandeliers of the public rooms. The walls were bare brushed metal. The floor was industrial composite. No marble, no crystal, no methane flower sculptures. This was where the work happened. He passed 2 other household staff members, Vayanthi, both of them young and junior, heading toward the staff quarters with the nervous energy of people who had just been told to stop working and didn't know what to do with their hands. They glanced at Marcus as he passed. He nodded. They looked away. He was a human. Humans were fixtures, not colleagues. Marcus entered the narrow service pantry adjacent to the banquet hall, set the tray on the counter, and began washing the abandoned Keithrani glove with a soft cloth and a mild solvent. The leather, or whatever the Keithrani equivalent was stiff with age and use, the stitching along the thumb worn almost through. This was not a ceremonial glove. This was the personal glove of a working envoy, someone who had put it on and taken it off hundreds of times across dozens of negotiations. Dropping it was not theater, it was grief. The distinction mattered. Marcus had learned it over 6 months of serving the Keithrani trade delegation aboard the Ascending Grace. Overseer Gallon, the Keithrani chief negotiator, was a heavy-set figure with dark amber skin and broad, expressive hands that he used when he spoke the way some people used their eyes to underline, to emphasize, to reach toward the person he was talking to. Gallon wore that left glove to every negotiation session, every working dinner, every preliminary meeting. It was old, it was personal. And Gallon had a habit, one Marcus had catalogued across 17 water glass refills and 4 cleared dessert plates, of adjusting the glove's thumb seam when he was thinking carefully about what to say next. Marcus repaired the torn seam with a needle and thread from his personal kit. Small stitches, tight, following the original stitch pattern, not because anyone had asked him to, because a working man's glove deserved better than a garbage chute. He hung the glove to dry on a hook above the sink and stood for a moment thinking. Marcus Wynne had spent 26 years in service. He had started at 18, working banquet halls in London for a catering company that served corporate functions and political dinners. He had moved to private service at 24, working for a retired diplomat named Hugh Beckett, whose household ran on the principle that good staff anticipated needs before they became visible. Beckett had taught him, not directly, never directly, but by the rhythm of his house and the expectations woven into its silence, that service was not about subservience. It was about observation. A good servant saw everything. A great servant understood what he saw. and a servant who understood what he saw had a responsibility to act on it, even when acting meant nothing more than making sure the right cup of tea was at the right temperature at the right time. Marcus saw everything aboard the Ascending Grace. He saw that the Keith Ronnie trade envoy had been willing to negotiate right up until the third course, when Ambassador Sevareth had made an offhand remark about Keith Ronnie commercial practices that used a particular Vayanthi grammatical construction, the diminutive possessive, that implied the Keith Ronnie economy was a subsidiary of the Vayanthi one. Sevareth had not meant it as an insult. The diminutive possessive was how the Vayanthi referred to anything outside their own administrative sphere. But to a Keith Ronnie, whose entire cultural identity was built on trade sovereignty, it was the linguistic equivalent of calling them a colonial holding. Marcus had heard the remark. He had watched Galen's face change, not anger, not at first, but something worse, recognition. The look of a man hearing what he had feared he would hear. Galen's right hand had moved to his left glove and adjusted the thumb seam, the thinking gesture, and Marcus had known at that moment that the negotiation was dead. The table went over 40 minutes later, but the death had happened in a single word. He dried his hands on a fresh cloth and left the pantry. The service corridor took him past the diplomatic corps offices, where junior attachés were hurrying between rooms with data tablets and the tight-jawed expressions of people who knew something had gone very wrong, but were not senior enough to know exactly what. Marcus moved through them like water through stones. He caught fragments of conversation. Ambassador Sevareth is convening an emergency review. The Keith Ronnie vessel has begun pre-undocking procedures. Who authorized the 7th course wine variation? Nobody was talking about the right thing. Nobody was asking what had actually killed the negotiation. Senior attaché Corin emerged from the ambassador's office as Marcus passed. Corin was Sevareth's second-in-command, a tall, sharp-featured Vayanthi with pale blue-silver skin, and the particular rigidity that came from spending a career making sure his superior never heard anything uncomfortable. He stopped when he saw Marcus. "The service wing is aft," Corin said. His luminous eyes moved over Marcus's uniform, the dark jacket, the tray, the clean hands, with the practiced dismissal of a man cataloging things that did not matter. "Yes, sir. I'm returning there now." "Then return faster." Marcus did not adjust his pace. Corin watched him for 2 seconds, decided he was beneath the threshold of things worth correcting, and continued down the corridor. Marcus filed the interaction away. Corin had not asked what Marcus was carrying on his tray. Corin had not noticed the Keith Ronnie glove, folded in a cloth, tucked beside the service kit. Corin saw a servant and saw nothing. He had been keeping a mental inventory of the Keith Ronnie delegation's behaviors since their first preliminary session, the way he kept an inventory of the Crystal Service, methodically, completely, without judgment. Galen was the center. He was flanked at every dinner by 2 junior Keith Ronnie negotiators, both younger, both deferential, both watching their overseer the way apprentices watched a master craftsman for cues. The one on Galen's left, a thin, angular figure with copper-dark skin and nervous hands, had a habit of tapping the table edge with one finger when he disagreed with something the Vayanthi said, but did not feel senior enough to speak. The one on Galen's right, broader, calmer, with the patient stillness of someone who had been trained to wait, took notes on a crystalline tablet and never looked up, but his writing speed changed depending on how the conversation was going. Fast and fluid when things were productive. Slow and deliberate when things were going wrong, as though he was choosing his words for a record he expected would be read later by people who would need to understand what had happened. At the final dinner, the right-hand negotiator had stopped writing entirely by the 4th course. His tablet sat dark on the table. He had folded his hands in his lap and was looking at Galen with the expression of someone watching a door close. Marcus had seen all of this. He had filed it alongside the seating arrangements, The food service timing, the lighting temperature, the ventilation settings, the angle of the crystal chandeliers, and the specific way Overseer Thesson had arranged the table flower's tall centerpiece, obscuring the sightline between Galen and the Empress, which meant neither of them could read the other's face during the critical middle courses. A small thing, one of dozens, all pointing in the same direction. Marcus continued past the diplomatic wing, through the junction corridor, past the formal reception rooms, all dark now, their crystal chandeliers dimmed to the amber standby glow, and into the stretch of corridor that bordered the Empress's private wing. The doors were closed, flanked by two of the Imperial sentinels, tall Vayanthi soldiers in ceremonial silver armor, their luminous pale violet eyes tracking him as he passed. They knew him. He passed this corridor 6 times a day. They did not stop him, but they did not acknowledge him either. He was a current in the wall, moving through conduits they could not be bothered to notice. Behind those doors, the Empress of the Vayanthi, Sovereign Ithara Veilsolen, was likely being told that 18 months of careful diplomatic groundwork had just collapsed, because her ambassador didn't understand that words meant different things to different people. Marcus had seen Empress Ithara exactly 41 times during his service, aboard the Ascending Grace. He had served her at 11 formal dinners, 4 private receptions, and 1 working breakfast. At 25 of those occasions, she had been accompanied by at least 2 members of her senior diplomatic corps, 3 sentinels, and an aide-de-camp who anticipated her beverage preferences with mechanical precision. At none of those occasions had anyone spoken to Marcus. He existed below the caste layer that separated real people from household furniture. But he had watched her. He had watched her carry conversations with hostile delegations for 3 hours, without her voice changing pitch. He had watched her navigate a 5-way dispute between species that didn't share a common greeting protocol, and do it so smoothly that each delegation left believing they had been the most important voice in the room. He had watched her eat a Keithrani ceremonial dish that her biology could barely tolerate, a fermented grain paced with a protein structure that made Vayanthi stomachs revolt, and finish every bite with a smile that never wavered because refusing the dish would have meant refusing the relationship. She was a diplomat down to the cellular level, and she was good at it the way Marcus was good at cleaning, with a competence so thorough it became invisible. But 41 observations was enough. And Marcus had noticed what no one else aboard the Ascending Grace seemed willing to see. Empress Ithara was exhausted. Not physically, though that too. Exhausted in the way that people got when they carried something alone for too long and nobody asked how heavy it was. He had seen it first at the 9th formal dinner, 3 months into his service. A moment between courses, when the table was busy with conversation and no one was looking at the head of it. Ithara's hand had rested on the table beside her water glass, and her fingers had trembled, a fine, barely perceptible vibration that lasted 3 seconds before she pressed her hand flat and stilled it. No one saw. Marcus saw. He was pouring wine 2 seats down, and he had the angle. He saw it again at the 14th dinner. A junior diplomat from the Esselari Confederacy made a crude joke about Vayanthi cultural rigidity, and the table laughed, all except the Empress, whose smile stayed perfectly fixed, while something behind her eyes went somewhere else entirely. Marcus recognized that look. He had seen it on the faces of people who had been performing for so long they had forgotten what their actual face felt like. He saw it at the 20th dinner, the 25th, the 30th. Small things. A slight stiffness in her posture during the final hour of a long negotiation, as though she were holding her spine in place by will alone. A tendency to touch the edge of her water glass without drinking from it, the way someone touches a doorknob when they are thinking about leaving. A habit of looking in the direction of the service staff when the room's attention was elsewhere, as though the part of the ship where nobody performed was the only part where she could rest her eyes. Nobody saw these things because nobody was looking. The diplomatic corps saw the Empress. The imperial sentinels saw the sovereign. The household staff saw a figure to be avoided and deferred to. Marcus saw a person who was tired and who had no one to tell. The emergency session lasted 4 hours. Marcus spent them in the service wing. He pressed the Keith Ronnie glove flat. He laundered and pressed 17 napkins from the ruined banquet. He inventoried the broken crystal, 43 pieces, ranging from goblet stems to the large centerpiece fragments. Total replacement cost estimated at 1,200 credits. He filed a replacement requisition for the methane flower centerpiece materials. He scrubbed the alkalite paste from the banquet hall floor during a brief window when the corridor sentinels changed shifts and the hall was unwatched. The stain came up clean. The marble looked as though nothing had ever happened on it. During the 3rd hour, Corin swept through the service corridor again, this time accompanied by 2 junior attachés carrying diplomatic briefing folders. He did not acknowledge Marcus, who was standing in the banquet hall doorway with a polishing cloth, working the edges of the marble door frame where a crystal fragment had left a scratch. The attachés glanced at Marcus. Corin did not. The 3 of them continued toward the emergency session, and Marcus heard Corin say, in the particular tone of a man rehearsing the version of events he intended to present, the tariff structure was never viable. The Keith Ronnie were looking for an exit. We need to reframe the failure as a structural incompatibility, not a diplomatic error. Marcus filed this away. Corin was wrong. The tariff structure had been viable. The Keith Ronnie had not been looking for an exit. Galen had spent 6 months at a negotiation table he could have left at any time. A man who is looking for an exit does not adjust his glove when he hears something painful. He takes the glove off. Galen had adjusted his glove 3 times before he finally took it off. That was a man trying to stay. Once, during the long wait, Marcus heard voices from the staff common room, 2 of the Vayanthi junior household members, talking in the low register their species used for private conversation. He caught enough to understand. They were discussing whether the ship would return to the home port early if the treaty collapsed. One of them was worried about a training certification that depended on completing a full diplomatic tour. The other was worried about whether the Keith Ronnie delegation would blame the household staff for the state of the banquet hall. Marcus leaned into the doorway. "The hall is clean," he said. "I handled it." They looked at him. The one worried about the hall, a young Vayanthi woman with pale silver-blue skin and the slightly too wide eyes of someone in their first posting, said, "The overseer said to leave it." The overseer said to leave it because the stain wasn't a priority. He was right about that. But the stain doesn't know it's not a priority, and acid eats marble whether anyone's watching or not. They stared at him for a moment. Then the young woman made a small sound, not quite a laugh, not quite acknowledgement. Something closer to the noise a person makes when a sentence lands in a place they weren't expecting. Marcus returned to the pantry and continued pressing the glove. At the end of 4 hours, Overseer Thesson's voice came through the staff comm. "All household, resume standard duties. The diplomatic corps has retired for the evening. Empress's private wing remains restricted." Marcus resumed his evening rounds. He checked the formal reception rooms, the small dining salon, the library, the observation gallery. Everything was in order except the observation gallery, where someone had left a half-empty cup of Vayanthi tea on the railing beside the viewport. He picked it up, turned it in his hands. The tea was cold. The cup was from the Empress's private service, identifiable by the thin silver band around the rim, a mark so subtle most people wouldn't notice it. The Empress had been here, recently, alone. She had stood at this viewport and looked out at the docking clamps where the Keith Ronnie vessel was still attached, and she had set down her tea and walked away without finishing it. Marcus had served this woman for 18 months. She always finished her tea. The half-empty cup told him what the emergency session's outcome had been more clearly than any briefing document could. He looked out the viewport. The Keith Ronnie ship sat in its docking cradle, running lights cycling in the amber pattern that meant pre-departure standby. Not yet gone, but preparing to go. Beyond the docking station, the stars were cold and still. Marcus washed the cup, dried it, and returned it to the Empress's private service cabinet in the small galley reserved for her personal provisions. Then he went to his quarters, a small room in the service wing, clean, spare, containing a narrow bed, a personal trunk, and a reading lamp, and slept 4 hours. He woke at 300 ship time, dressed, and began his pre-dawn rounds. The ascending grace was quiet. The corridors were empty. The formal spaces sat in their programmed half-light, the crystal chandeliers dimmed to a warm amber glow that made the marble look like honeyed stone. He started with the banquet hall. The floor was clean. The chairs had been adjusted by the junior staff during their evening shift, but they hadn't caught the head chair, which was still pushed too far back from the table. Marcus corrected it. His hands knew the measurements the way a musician's hands knew frets. He moved through the reception rooms, the small salon, the library. He dusted surfaces that didn't need dusting. He adjusted lighting panels that were a fraction too bright. He checked the flower arrangements, living Vayanthi crystal blooms in silver vases, and removed 2 that had begun to dull, replacing them from the reserve stock in the service pantry. At 3:40, he entered the observation gallery. Empress Ithara was standing at the viewport. She was alone. No sentinels, no attendants, no diplomatic staff. She wore a simple pale blue robe instead of her formal vestments, the kind of garment someone put on when they couldn't sleep and didn't expect to be seen. Her silver-white hair, usually arranged in the elaborate braided crown that Vayanthi sovereignty required, hung loose over her shoulders. Without the formal framing, her face looked younger and older at the same time. The high cheekbones and luminous pale blue eyes of her species' aristocratic beauty, but with a tiredness in the set of her mouth that no amount of ceremonial composure could entirely disguise. She was crying. Not openly, not dramatically. The Vayanthi did not cry the way humans did. There were no tears. Instead, the faint bioluminescent markings on her temples, usually a steady, subtle glow, were flickering unevenly, a stuttering pulse of pale violet light that Marcus had learned, through 18 months of careful observation, was the Vayanthi physiological equivalent of weeping. It was something they could control in public. It was something they couldn't control when they were alone and had stopped trying. Marcus stood in the doorway for 3 seconds. He could leave. He should leave. The observation gallery technically fell outside the restricted zone, but finding the Empress here at this hour in this state was clearly not something he was meant to witness. A proper servant would withdraw silently and pretend he had seen nothing. Marcus had been a proper servant for 26 years. He had withdrawn silently from rooms hundreds of times. He had pretended not to see grief, anger, relief, fear, loneliness, all the things that powerful people showed when they thought the staff had gone. He was good at it. It was part of the job. But there was a difference between discretion and abandonment. Discretion was not looking at someone's face when they needed privacy. Abandonment was walking away when they needed a cup of tea. He walked into the gallery. His soft-soled shoes made no sound on the floor. He moved to the small service station at the far end of the room, a recessed counter built into the wall, equipped with a compact heating element, a rack of cups, and a sealed canister of the Empress's preferred tea blend. He knew the blend because he had inventoried the ship's entire provisions list in his first week and committed the Empress's personal preferences to memory. Not because anyone had asked him to, because that was what a good servant did. He heated water. He measured tea 2 measures, steeped 4 minutes, the way she took it at formal functions when the aide-de-camp wasn't watching the proportions closely enough. He poured. The cup was Vayanthi porcelain, thin-walled, with the silver rim band of the Empress's private service. He set it on a small tray with a folded cloth napkin and carried it to the viewport railing. He placed the tray 3 feet to the Empress's left, without looking at her face. He adjusted the cup so the handle faced her hand. He set the napkin beside it. Then he stepped back and stood at the wall, hands folded behind his back, eyes forward, in the posture of a servant who was present and available and not watching. The gallery was silent except for the deep hum of the ascending Grace's drives and the faint whisper of air circulation. Stars moved slowly past the viewport, their light cold and indifferent. For a long time, the Empress did not move. Then her hand reached out and touched the cup. She lifted it. She drank. Marcus stood. The drives hummed. Stars drifted. "The Keithrani glove," the Empress said. Her voice was quiet, steady, the controlled tone of someone reassembling their composure around a sentence, the way a mason rebuilds a wall around a crack. She was not looking at him. She was looking at the stars. The left hand. "You recovered it." It was not a question. She had been told, or she had seen it on the service log, or she simply knew, the way someone who spent their life reading rooms knew what happened in them even when they weren't present. "Yes, ma'am," Marcus said. "The diplomatic corps would have discarded it." "It's not theirs to discard, ma'am. It belongs to Overseer Gallon. The seam on the thumb was torn. I repaired it." A pause. The bioluminescent markings on her temples steadied, the flickering slowing to something closer to their normal rhythm. She took another sip of tea. "You repaired a Keithrani envoy's personal glove." "The stitching was failing. It's an old glove, well used." "A man who adjusts his glove, when he's thinking carefully, deserves to have the stitching hold." The silence shifted. Something in it changed weight. "You noticed that habit," the Empress said. "It was not a question either." "I refilled his water glass 17 times during the preliminary sessions, ma'am. You notice things when you're the one nobody's looking at." She turned her head slightly, not toward him, toward the space between the viewport and the wall where he stood. The bioluminescent markings pulsed once, not weeping, something else. Something Marcus didn't have a name for, a kind of recognition. "What is your name?" the Empress asked. "Marcus Wynne, ma'am, household staff. Service attendant, formal dining." "How long have you served aboard this ship, Marcus Wynne?" 18 months, ma'am." 18 months. She said it as though tasting the number, finding it strange. "And in 18 months, you are the first person on this ship who has identified what happened at that banquet." Marcus said nothing. It was not his place to agree or disagree with the Empress. "The diplomatic corps believes the Keithrani walked out because of a disagreement over trade tariff structures," she continued. "Ambassador Sevareth filed a preliminary report within the hour. Tariff disagreement. Cultural incompatibility on rate schedules. 4 pages of analysis on economic positions and counterpositions. Senior attaché Corin endorsed it without a single question. The entire diplomatic team has spent the last 4 hours building a response strategy around revised tariff terms." She set down the cup. "They are entirely wrong." "Yes, ma'am," Marcus said. Another silence. This one was deliberate. The Empress was doing what Marcus had seen her do at negotiation tables, creating a space that demanded filling. It was a technique. It worked on diplomats, on ambassadors, on heads of state. It worked on most people. Marcus did not fill it. He stood at the wall and waited. He had 26 years of practice at comfortable silence. After 15 seconds, the faintest shadow of something that was not quite amusement crossed the Empress's face. "You heard the remark," she said. "The diminutive possessive," Marcus said. "Third course." Ambassador Sevareth used it in reference to Keithrani commercial sovereignty. In Vayanthi, it's standard grammar for external entities. In Keithrani cultural context, it implies colonial subordination. Gallon's hand went to his glove at the moment Sevareth used it. He adjusted the thumb seam, the thinking gesture, and he did not speak for the rest of the third course. The table went over 40 minutes later, but the negotiation ended in that sentence. The Empress was very still. "You parsed the linguistic transgression. the cultural signal, and the precise behavioral indicator in real time. I poured wine, ma'am. I had a clear sightline and nothing else to do but watch. Marcus Wynne, I have a staff of 43 accredited diplomatic professionals aboard this ship. Not one of them identified the diminutive possessive as the catalyst. Not one of them noticed the glove adjustment. Not one of them understood that Overseer Gallon left this ship in grief rather than anger. With respect, ma'am, they weren't in a position to see it. They were at the table. I was behind it. A person at the table is part of the performance. A person behind it is part of the room. The room sees everything. Yes, the Empress said quietly. The room sees everything. That is precisely the point. She picked up the cup and drank the last of the tea. Then she turned fully and looked at him. He met her gaze for 1 second, long enough to see her clearly, to see the exhaustion that lived behind the composure, the weight of a woman who had spent decades reading other people's signals and had run out of people who could read hers. And then he dropped his eyes, because a servant did not hold the Empress's gaze. "Tell me," she said, "if you had been advising Ambassador Sevarth before the dinner, what would you have told him?" "I'm not qualified to advise anyone, ma'am." "I did not ask about your qualifications. I asked what you would have told him." Marcus was quiet for a moment. The drives hummed. The stars moved past like slow-falling snow. "3 things," he said. "First, the seating." The Keithrani were placed with their backs to the viewport, which in Keithrani spatial culture puts them in the subordinate position. The room was telling them they were lesser before anyone said a word. They should have been seated facing the viewport, or at a round table where no position is dominant. He paused. Second, the food timing. Vayanthi custom is to serve all courses simultaneously. The Keithrani eat sequentially. Each course has a meaning in sequence, and serving them all at once strips the meaning out. Gallon was already uncomfortable by the 3rd course. He'd barely touched the first 2 because they arrived alongside dishes that in Keithrani meal structure should have come later. It's a small thing. But it told him that nobody on our side had thought about how his people eat. Another pause. Third, the language. The ambassador's translators should have flagged the diminutive possessive. They didn't. Either they don't know Keithrani cultural linguistics well enough or they assumed it didn't matter. Ambassador Sevarth used it 3 times during the dinner. The first time, Gallon's jaw tightened. The second time, he adjusted his glove. The third time, he looked at the door. 40 minutes later, the table went over. 3 escalating signals in a single evening, and not one person at that table read them. 3 chances to correct course, the Empress said quietly. Each one missed. Not missed, ma'am, unseen. There's a difference. The diplomatic corps wasn't looking at the wrong thing. They were looking at the right thing from the wrong angle. They saw a trade negotiation. Gallon saw a sovereignty test. Those are 2 different rooms. The Empress set the empty cup on the tray. She was quiet for a long time, and Marcus could see the bioluminescent markings on her temples pulsing slowly, steadily, the thinking rhythm. "Marcus Wynne," she said. "The Keithrani have begun pre-undocking procedures. In approximately 8 hours, they will be beyond communications range. If I send a diplomatic message before then, I have one opportunity to prevent the collapse of this treaty. One message. The diplomatic corps has drafted 3 versions." "All 3 are wrong," Marcus said. It was not a question. He had not read the drafts. He did not need to. If the diplomatic corps was building their response around revised tariff terms, every draft would be an answer to the wrong question. The Empress looked at him with an expression he had never seen on her face at a formal function. It was the expression of someone who had been speaking a language no one understood, and had just heard someone speak it back. "I need someone who understands why the glove was dropped," she said. "Not someone who understands trade law, not someone who understands Vayanthi protocol, someone who understands grief." Marcus stood at the wall. His hands were folded behind his back. His uniform was pressed. His shoes were silent on the floor. He thought about 26 years of service. About Hugh Beckett, the retired diplomat in London who had taught him that seeing clearly was its own form of responsibility. About the 41 dinners he had served aboard this ship, watching the Empress carry an empire's weight with a composure so total that no one thought to ask whether it was sustainable. About the Keith Ronnie glove he had repaired, the worn leather, the fraying thumb, the grief embedded in the act of letting go. The message should begin with the glove, he said. Ithara's bioluminescent markings flared once briefly, brightly, then steadied. It was surprise. Marcus had never seen the Empress surprised. "Explain," she said. Overseer Gallon dropped his personal glove. Not a ceremonial piece, his working glove, the one he's worn through decades of negotiations. In Keith Ronnie culture, the left glove represents the hand that shakes, the hand that reaches. Dropping it means the handshake is withdrawn, but the glove also represents the relationship itself. By leaving it behind, he's saying, I am leaving something of myself in this room. I am leaving because I have to, not because I want to. Marcus paused. The diplomatic corps wants to send a message about tariff concessions, revised terms, economic restructuring. All of that says, we heard your complaints about the numbers, but Gallon didn't leave because of the numbers. He left because the ambassador spoke to him in a grammar that made him feel small. He left because the room was arranged to make him subordinate. He left because the food was served in a way that ignored how his people eat. He left because every detail of that banquet told him the same thing. We did not think about you. We did not see you. He let the word settle. The message needs to say, we saw you, not your trade position, not your economic value to the Vayanthi commercial sphere. You. And the glove. Return it, with the message. Don't mention that it's been repaired. He'll know. A man who has worn the same glove through 30 years of negotiations will notice that the thumb seam has been restitched, and he'll understand what that means, that someone on this ship cared enough to fix something small, not because they were ordered to, because it mattered. The Empress stood at the viewport for a long time. The stars moved. The drives hummed their low note. Marcus could not read her expression because she had turned slightly away, and the bioluminescent markings were hidden from his angle. Draft the message, she said. Ma'am. You will draft the message, Marcus Wynne. You will write it in standard galactic. I will review it, translate the critical passages into formal Keith Ronnie courtesy register, and send it under my personal seal. The diplomatic corps will not be consulted. Marcus opened his mouth to say that he was a household servant and household servants did not draft diplomatic communications. Then he closed it. The Empress had not asked for his opinion on whether he was qualified. She had asked him to do a thing, and in 26 years of service, Marcus had never declined a task that needed doing. I'll need the formal seal format, he said. I don't know the layout. I will provide it. And I'll need the glove back. I hung it in the service pantry. Get it. He left the observation gallery and walked through the service corridors to the pantry. The glove hung where he had left it, dry now. The repaired thumb seemed tight and clean. He folded it carefully in a fresh cloth and carried it back. In the observation gallery, the Empress had moved from the viewport to the small writing desk built into the wall beneath the star charts. She had activated the surface display and pulled up a blank diplomatic message form, a format Marcus had never seen up close but recognized from the header structure. Personal sovereign dispatch, single recipient, classification above diplomatic corps clearance. She looked at him, he looked at the desk. He sat down. The chair was too tall for him. Vayanthi furniture was scaled for a species that averaged a head taller than humans, and his feet didn't quite rest flat on the floor. He adjusted, pulling himself forward, and set the folded glove on the desk beside the display. He began to write. The message took him an hour. He wrote slowly, carefully, choosing each word the way he chose each motion when he set a table, with attention to what the recipient would see and how they would feel seeing it. The opening paragraph acknowledged the rupture without apologizing for it, because the Keithrani did not respect apologies, they respected acknowledgement. It named what had happened. Not the table going over, not the raised voices, not the theater of the walkout, but the sentence. The specific sentence, in the specific grammatical form, that had told a trade sovereign his people's autonomy, was a footnote in someone else's language. The second paragraph explained that the usage reflected Vayanthi grammatical convention, not Vayanthi intent, and that the distinction was one the Vayanthi sovereign recognized and regretted failing to ensure her representatives understood. Marcus chose the word recognized carefully, not apologizes for, recognition. The Keithrani valued being seen more than being soothed. The third paragraph proposed a resumption of talks under a restructured format. Keithrani originated proposals, Vayanthi response, mutual term setting with neither party holding origination authority, new seating arrangements, sequential meal service during working dinners, a cultural attaché added to the ambassador's team, someone whose job was to listen to how words landed, not just what they said. The fourth paragraph, and this was the part Marcus labored over longest, was personal. It spoke of the glove. It did not say the glove had been repaired. It said only that the glove had been found, and that the sovereign was returning it because what it represented, a hand extended, a relationship maintained through decades of difficult work, was not something the Vayanthi regarded as disposable. He read it back. He changed 4 words. He read it again. He changed one more, respect, to regard, because regard in standard galactic carried a connotation of sustained attention that respect did not. Then he pushed the display toward the Empress. She read it in silence. Her eyes moved across the text once, twice, 3 times. The bioluminescent markings on her temples flickered once, not weeping, not surprise. Something Marcus could only describe as the expression of a person who had been holding a weight alone and had just felt someone else put a hand under it. She made 2 changes. One was a Keithrani courtesy term he hadn't known, a formal address that acknowledged Galen's clan seniority. The other was a structural adjustment to the closing line that shifted it from standard galactic diplomatic register into what she called personal sovereign voice. A register so rarely used that most Vayanthi diplomats had never seen it. It was the voice a sovereign used when speaking not as a head of state, but as a person. "This will do," she said. She affixed her personal seal. She attached a priority routing code that bypassed the diplomatic corps entirely. She placed the folded glove in a sealed courier pouch, attached it to the message, and dispatched both to the Ascending Graces communications array. Then she sat back in the chair and looked at Marcus. He stood beside the desk, hands folded, eyes forward, in the posture of a servant who had completed a task and was waiting to be dismissed. "Sit down, Marcus Wynne," she said. There was something in her voice that hadn't been there before. Not warmth exactly. The Empress was not warm in the way that word usually meant. Something more precise. The particular regard of someone who had just seen a person clearly for the first time and was rearranging the room around that fact. "I've been sitting, ma'am. Your chairs are too tall for me." The faintest shadow of something that might have been amusement crossed her face. "Then stand if you prefer, but stay." He stayed. She asked him questions, not about the message, which was sent and beyond changing, but about the ship, what he had observed in 18 months, what the household staff discussed when the diplomatic corps wasn't listening, what the junior attaches said to each other when they thought no one was paying attention. Marcus answered honestly. He told her that the junior attaches were afraid of Ambassador Sevarath because he rewarded agreement and punished dissent, which meant his briefings contained only the information he wanted to hear. He told her that senior attaché Corin filtered everything upward through a lens of what would make Sevareth look competent, which meant the information the Empress received from the diplomatic corps had been filtered twice before it reached her. Once by the attaches who were afraid, and once by the attaché who was ambitious. He told her that the household staff resented the diplomatic corps habit of calling emergency sessions without providing clear instructions, which created confusion and reduced the staff's ability to maintain the ship during crises. He told her that the engineering staff, the humans in particular, had noticed that the ship's internal communications system routed household traffic on a lower priority band than diplomatic traffic, which meant that during emergencies, the people responsible for keeping the ship physically functional were the last to receive information. Small things, the Empress said. Small things stack, ma'am. Galen was uncomfortable before the third course. The food timing contributed. The seating contributed. The lighting in the banquet hall was set 2 degrees cool, which is standard Vayanthi formal but reads as clinical to Keith Ronnie, who associate warm light with trust and cool light with interrogation. Every detail in that room was built for Vayanthi comfort. None of it was built for Keith Ronnie comfort. The ambassador's words were the final weight on a scale that had been tipping all evening. The Empress was quiet for a long time. "Marcus Wynne," she said, "you are wasted in formal dining." "I'm a good dining servant, ma'am." "You are a good many things. What I need, what I have needed for longer than I am willing to admit, is someone who sees what my diplomatic corps refuses to look at. Someone who understands that a dropped glove is not a tantrum but a wound. Someone who reads a room from the service corridor, where the only agenda is keeping the floor clean." Marcus was quiet. The stars moved past the viewport. "I am offering you a position," she continued. "Cultural observer to the sovereign's personal office. Informal, no title. No rank, no uniform change. You would continue to serve in the dining hall and the household because that is where you see best, but you would report to me, directly, not through Thesson, not through the diplomatic corps, to me." He thought about it. He thought about 26 years of service, about the rooms he had cleaned and the tables he had set, and the conversations he had overheard and filed away because there was no one to tell. He thought about Hugh Beckett's household in London and the lesson that had lived in its silence, that seeing clearly was not a talent. It was a responsibility. "May I ask a condition, ma'am?" "Ask." "I stay in the service wing. I keep my quarters, I keep my rounds. I don't attend meetings, I don't sit in briefing rooms, and nobody on the diplomatic corps knows what I do. The moment I become visible, I stop being useful. The reason I see what I see is because I'm the man with the tray. Take the tray away, and I'm just another person at the table with an opinion." The Empress studied him. The bioluminescent markings on her temples pulsed slowly, steadily, the thinking rhythm. "You wish to remain invisible," she said. "I wish to remain in the room where I can see clearly, ma'am. That room happens to be the one nobody looks at." A long silence. Stars drifted past the viewport. The drives hummed their low, constant note. "Agreed," the Empress said. Marcus picked up the empty teacup and the tray. He folded the napkin. He turned toward the door. "Marcus Wynne." He stopped. The tea was the correct temperature. "Yes, ma'am, it always is." He walked out of the observation gallery, through the service corridor, past the closed doors of the Empress's private wing, where the sentinels stood like silver statues in the dim light. He returned the cup to the private service cabinet. He checked the banquet hall one final time, the stain gone, the chairs aligned, the broken crystal catalogued and queued for replacement. He adjusted the lighting in the observation gallery by 2 degrees warmer, because at 400 ship time the automatic settings ran slightly cool, and the Empress, he had noticed, preferred warmth when she was reading alone. Then he returned to his quarters, hung his jacket on the hook behind the door, and sat on the edge of his bed in the small, spare room that no one on the ship thought about. 12 hours later, the Ascending Grace received a reply from the Keith Ronnie vessel. It was short. It was addressed not to the diplomatic corps or the ambassador's office, but to the personal sovereign seal. It contained 3 words in Keith Ronnie formal register. The hand returns. In Keith Ronnie diplomatic language, that was the most significant phrase in their lexicon. It meant, I am reaching back. It meant, the relationship is not ended. It meant that Overseer Gallon had received his glove, had noticed the repaired thumb seam, and had understood exactly what it meant. When the news reached the diplomatic corps, there was confusion, then relief, then a scramble to understand what had happened. Ambassador Sevarth requested a full briefing on the message that had been sent under the sovereign seal. Senior Attaché Corin demanded to know who had bypassed the diplomatic chain. Overseer Thesson was asked whether any household staff had been involved. Thesson said no. Marcus confirmed nothing and denied nothing because nobody asked him. The Empress said nothing. She did not need to. The reply spoke for itself. In the days that followed, the Keith Ronnie returned to the negotiation table. The talks resumed under a restructured format. Keith Ronnie originated proposals, mutual term setting, sequential meal service, revised seating. Ambassador Sevarth was not replaced, but a cultural attaché was quietly added to his team. A young Vayanthi linguist named Elorin who had been buried in the translation department and who understood, without being told why, that her job was to listen to how words landed. Marcus served at the next 3 dinners. He poured wine. He cleared plates. He noted that Corin watched the cultural attaché with the careful displeasure of a man who suspected his information monopoly was being eroded. He noted that Elorin sat at the far end of the table and said very little but listened to everything, and that the Keith Ronnie delegation's body language had changed. More open, more forward-leaning, more settled. On the second dinner, he refilled Overseer Gallon's water glass. Gallon was wearing his left glove. The repaired thumb seam was barely visible. As Marcus set the glass down, Gallon looked up at him, the first time any Keith Ronnie had looked directly at a Vayanthi household servant in the history of the Ascending Grace, and gave a single, slow nod. Not a thank you, something deeper, the nod of one working person to another, a man who fixed things recognizing a man who fixed things. Marcus nodded back, then he moved to the next glass. The treaty was signed 6 weeks later. The ceremony was formal, elaborate, held in the banquet hall that Marcus had scrubbed clean the night the Keith Ronnie walked out. Crystal goblets were filled with Ilashan black vintage. Speeches were made. Ambassador Sevarth took credit for what he called a new paradigm in Vayanthi-Keith Ronnie relations. The diplomatic corps applauded. Senior Attaché Corin smiled the smile of a man who had already begun rewriting history to include himself. The Empress smiled the smile she wore at formal functions, the one that was perfect and professional and showed nothing of whatever lived behind it. But once, briefly, between the 3rd and 4th toast, her gaze moved from the table to the wall where Marcus stood with his tray. He met her eyes for 1 second. She did not nod. She did not smile. The bioluminescent markings on her temples pulsed once, slowly, in a rhythm Marcus had never seen before, something between recognition and gratitude, and the quiet exhaustion of a woman who had been seen and was still deciding what to do with the weight of that. Then her eyes moved back to the table, and Marcus poured wine. After the ceremony, he cleared the hall. He washed the goblets. He swept the marble. He aligned the chairs. On his way back through the service corridor, he passed the observation gallery. The door was open. The viewport showed stars and the running lights of the Keith Ronnie vessel, still docked, its crew celebrating aboard their own ship. The Empress was not there. But the writing desk was lit, and on its surface, weighted down by the empty teacup, was a single sheet of crystal paper. On it, In the Empress's personal handwriting, not the formal diplomatic script but the hand she used when she was writing for herself, were 3 words. "The hand stays." Marcus read them. He folded the paper and put it in his jacket pocket. He washed the teacup, dried it, and returned it to the service cabinet. Then he picked up his tray, straightened his jacket, and walked the silent corridor back toward the world where no one looked at him, which was exactly where he needed to be.